Welcome to this edition of Biblically Speaking, the podcast. I'm your host, Jared Bowman, and with me, as always, is my co-host, my ride or die, the brother that I had three others, but I wish I'd had him as a fourth, Brian Tiberius Haynes. We have got a show today. This is one of the most requested episodes that we've ever done. A lot of people want to know what our thoughts are on the subject of the historicity of Christ. Historicity is a fancy word. What does that mean?
So historicity refers to the idea of whether or not something has a historical evidence or a historical proof that it can be demonstrated apart from its own claim to be historically relevant.
So if you are skeptical about Jesus, or if you're someone who's trying to answer the arguments of skeptics, you're going to want to stay tuned all the way through this episode because we're looking at it from both sides, both historical evidence and answering some of the claims that are frequently made about Jesus. But let's jump right into it, Brian. And I'll start with this question. There's been a lot of books that have been written about this. Lee Strobel's A Case for Christ comes to mind. It's actually one that's written at a level that most people could just sort of pick up and read. Why does this question matter?
The kind of conversation that a Christian will have with somebody who's not a Christian. You'll be talking to them and you'll say, hey, I'd love you to come to church with me. And they'll say, well, I don't believe in Christianity. And if you dig a little deeper, you might find that they're going to say, I just don't think that Jesus was a real person. If Jesus was a real person, then you have to really work hard to deny the things he had to say and his claims about being God. And there's a lot to that. But if you can simply dismiss Jesus as actually ever having been a real person, then you really don't have to address the things that Jesus said and such. So probably just about anybody who's had a conversation with somebody who says, I'm not a Christian, not a believer of any kind, has probably brought up at some point why it is they don't believe in Jesus, that they don't even believe Jesus existed.
Correct me if I'm wrong. This is a fairly recent argument. I mean, up until maybe the last 20 years, I don't know many scholars that really debated this question at all over whether or not there was a Jesus. I mean, they would debate whether or not he was a miracle worker, whether or not he claimed to be the Son of God and all kinds of things. But I don't know very many people that actually doubted that there was a person in history called Jesus that was alive at the time that Christ was alive, and a movement formed around him in the region of Palestine. The big answer to the question for me is if there is no Jesus, there is no Christ, there is no Christianity, there is no hope. And so the fundamental tenet of our salvation is that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. If you can knock down, as you just mentioned, that first pin, then the rest of the pins sort of fall in line. So let's talk about that. Why is there this sudden resurgence or maybe sudden occurrence? People that are historically are doubting that there was historically someone called Jesus, and why is that a spurious argument, or is it a spurious argument?
Well, you're correct to say that it wasn't until the 20th century that anybody would have considered denying that Jesus existed. And the reason was quite simple. It wasn't so much because people said, well, there's so much information about Jesus, we wouldn't deny it. The number one testimony that Jesus exists is that Christianity exists. And it came from some. Mm-hmm. And so you're simply saying that the most logical, the most obvious answer is that Christianity was started by Jesus Christ, that's the thing that even if a historian was not a believer, I would think of somebody like Will Durant. He was a early 20th century historian, wrote a history that a lot of people are very familiar with. And one of his history books was Christ and Caesar. And, he had no problem contrasting Jesus Christ with Julius Caesar as both being, historically real people. Now, in the latter half of the 20th century, there was some pretty big revisionist history movements that took place in universities and such, and it called for a lot of rethinking. And I don't mean any of this in a good way, a lot of rethinking of the way that we approach history. So you saw a lot of changes in the way American history was taught. You saw a lot of changes in the way world history was taught.
This is outside of kind of the usual suspects of the new atheists and things like that. You're talking a larger, more culturally significant movement than that, right?
Well, yeah, it was purely academic. So I don't know if cultural would be the right way to say it, because it really just took place in universities and such. And it was this movement towards revisionist history, oftentimes, oddly enough, wanted to take the most controversial viewpoints, one of them being that there was no Jesus Christ. And again, you're talking about people that don't believe in Jesus or are merely cultural Christians. They might say, well, I'm a Christian, but I don't really think that Jesus lived, or things of that nature. If you go to a university today, a secular university, and you take a world history class and they delve into Jesus Christ, you're probably more likely than not that the that the text and the teacher is going to approach it that Jesus wasn't really a real person. Now, they'll probably accept the idea that Peter and Paul and the apostles, that they were real people, which is kind of interesting,
Mhm.
but they won't accept the idea that Jesus himself was a real person.
Yeah, and that's kind of a strange thing. I mean, you use the example of because there is a Christianity, there must be a Christ, that there, at least someone who identified himself as Jesus, that it's basically like they're saying this religion formed out of whole cloth. I mean, you're talking about people that, when you're talking about Peter and Paul, you're talking about people who are contemporaries of Jesus. And it's sort of strange. It would be a little bit like denying that there was a Muhammad and
Right.
who lived in the late 5th to early 6th century, if memory serves. And you've got a whole religion that's basically built around him. History bears with this religion. And we're not even just talking about history. We're talking about enlightened history. We're talking about history after the Greeks, who were sort of the progenitors of what we think of as modern science today and things like that, that it would be very unusual for a religion to have formed around a person that never existed and could have been proved not to have ever existed.
Oh yeah, it really is a striking concept to say that if Jesus doesn't exist, but Christianity does exist, and Christianity is as ancient as Jesus is right now. And I say this carefully, right now, those are not facts that people deny. Those are not statements that somebody says, "Well, I don't think Christianity existed till 500 or 600 years afterwards." Now, by the way,
That
but it's
would
getting
be
popular.
incredibly strange because of historians like
Yeah,
Irenaeus and Josephus, some of the
two
others.
Roman historians that are
Tacitus is the
talking
one
this
I'm
shit.
thinking of. They mention Christianity. They're not exactly contemporaries with Jesus, but they're close enough, as we've mentioned in other programs. This is evidence of at least culturally alive at that time. There was a religious group known as Christians. The Bible records that they weren't even known as Christians until about midway through the 1st century, where they were called in Antioch Christians. Before that, they were called believers, or they were called the sect of the way, because Jesus said he was the way. And it's just sort of interesting that you can revise something that there's this much historical data. One of the things that I liked about, and I sort of refreshed my memory on some of the things that Strobel wrote, because I wanted to give people kind of a touchstone that they could go out and check out this book themselves if they wanted to, that was easy enough to read. One of the things that he points out is really the manuscript evidence for the historicity of Jesus, both the age of the Bible and people writing about Jesus within a generation or two of his lifetime, beyond just the Bible. So what would we rely on for that? Why is that so important for determining whether or not there actually was a historical figure named Jesus?
Well, right off the top, somebody says, "I don't believe Jesus is real because he's not documented in history." Now, what they're really saying is he's not documented in a history that I'm going to listen to, because
Right.
Jesus is, as far as ancient persons go, probably one of the most documented people in ancient history. The issue that they have is that the people that documented him, almost all of them were his followers, that they're the ones that wrote these stories about him. Now, they wrote very historically significant texts, particularly Luke, who wrote like a historian, who documented things like a historian, but even Matthew, Mark, and John, writing about the life of Jesus, wrote in ways that gave a very important concept of something we called falsifiability in their documentation. So
Ooh,
you
that's a big
have that
word. What's
right
that
at the
mean?
all right, yeah, yeah. So falsifiability is that you give enough detail or you give enough relevant information that allows something to be confirmed to be true or not true. So, in other words, you give the name of the Roman emperor who was emperor at the time and the governor of the
Hmm.
territory, and you give a lot of details that allow somebody to say, if a person that was contemporary to this was looking at it, they could say, no, this is not real. You're giving details that could easily be proven wrong if they're wrong. But
Hmm.
as for being correct, they themselves are not significant other than they build a mountain of evidence that suggests that something is real. And
Hmm.
particularly the book of Luke accomplishes that. But actually, Matthew, Mark, and John also are very good about creating that kind of information for us.
I think one of the interesting things about it, I liked your phrasing there, mountain of evidence, is by the time you're done with the collection of New Testament manuscripts that we have, you're up around 24,000 different manuscripts that are all statistically similar, that there's very little variation some minor misspellings. There may be some words that are moved around in context for variations, but there's never disagreement. And we're talking about fragments the size of that are smaller than credit cards to entire sections of scrolls being available for us to look at, dating back some as early as, what was it, the second or third century that we looked at when we were doing the episode on Did the Catholic Church Give Us the Bible? It's relatively close to the lifetime of Jesus, and there's 24,000 different manuscripts that have been located. Can you speak to that a little bit and why that's significant?
Yeah. So one of the things, and I think Strobel is the one who kind of brings this up as well in his book, is that you take another ancient writer, and was it Strobel that wrote about Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars? I want to say that that's the comparative text he goes to. He talks about Plato. How do we know that these men wrote the documents they wrote? Well, they're attested to in history, but as far as an original manuscript, the word manuscript means handwritten. Of course, obviously nothing that they wrote survives, but we have close copies of them. One of the fascinating things about ancient Bible manuscripts is that they outnumber any other contemporary ancient document by multiples of 10. That, in other words, there are so many more ancient manuscripts of the Bible than there are these other ancient manuscripts. I just really can't put enough weight into saying why that's such a big deal, except to say that you're somebody who says, well, I don't believe in Jesus. Well, you really shouldn't believe in Julius Caesar. Or you really shouldn't believe in most of your Roman histories. You certainly couldn't believe in Alexander the Great. You couldn't believe in kings like Nebuchadnezzar or Sennacherib or these ancient people that almost nobody could be proven to exist. If somebody wants to say, I don't believe Jesus existed because I don't believe there's enough testimony in history, Jesus is easily the most testified to person in ancient history.
There's a mountain of evidence, including the Gospels, but there's a mountain of evidence that suggests that Jesus is a historical figure. How about the earliness of that testimony? I was thinking about 2 Peter chapter 1. Peter talks about the things that he was an eyewitness to and how he wanted to pass those on before he died. I'm paraphrasing, but in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 16, and the importance of passing those things on so that they could call them to mind after he was gone. Isn't it interesting that you do have this historical figure that is written about by those who are following him the closest, and we have their eyewitness testimony?
Before I even go to that, I'll just kind of put a little preface into this. We're not using terms like inspiration or, divine protection or things like that we normally do when we talk about scriptures, because we're just talking about this from a purely historical standpoint. We're trying to address this in a historically relevant way. Is Jesus a historical character? So when we talk about the scriptures, we talk about the Bible, we're not even talking about the idea that it was supernaturally maintained or things like that. We're saying it's just a remarkable ancient text in and of itself. Even if you're an absolute atheist, the Bible turns out is the most remarkable ancient manuscript ever compiled. Well, to the Christian early testimony, the idea is this, that of course the writers of the Gospels, two of them, perhaps three of them, are claimed to be eyewitnesses of these things. And Mark is either an eyewitness or he is taking the eyewitness testimony of Peter. But Matthew and John, for certain, are eyewitnesses of these things and attested to by the other writers. Now, what's really incredible is that when Luke writes his book like a researcher. The very first thing he tells the person he's writing to is, he says, I researched this. I talked to them. I compiled information. I'm not an eyewitness. Now, Luke introduces us to himself in the second half of the book of Acts as being somebody from Troas, and that he's a man that is he's called a physician elsewhere. And so we kind of take a lot of the language he uses and interpret it that way. But the point is this, he is an actual historian as he writes. So he compiles information. And what's incredible is that it doesn't come out with a whole different story than Matthew, Mark, and John did. I'm going to tell you things you never heard. You're not going to write a book and say, hey, guess what? My book is more or less going to say the same thing that the other book said. That's what's really incredible about this. Now, as far as the early testimony, we know the earliest manuscript fragments, I think the oldest ones come out of John. And I want to say it goes back to probably the end of the 1st century. So within about 40 years after it was written, we're finding pieces, tiny pieces of it. Then we're finding bigger pieces in the middle of the 2nd century, 150 AD. The oldest entire books we have are in the 200s. And so what we know is that we have a certainty that these books were written soon after, if not during the time of the apostles and Jesus. And so right away, that gives it more credibility than, say, our testimonies about Alexander the Great. The testimony of Jesus is written just within decades. So there are people alive that, as they're writing these books and that they're describing the life of Jesus, the accuracy of these things is really, really remarkable to be written within that close of a time period. There's just not many ancient histories, like I said, that can make that claim to say these are documents that go to the time of the events that are happening. Let's even dig into the idea of an eyewitness. I mean, it has always been understood from a legal standpoint that the testimony of an eyewitness, when it's verified, that an eyewitness requires a verification of a type. But the concept of the testimony of an eyewitness has always been seen as evidentiary. In other words, it is a type of evidence towards a proof that something is real. So somebody's arrested for robbing a bank. Eyewitnesses say, that's the guy, that's the guy, that's the guy. Now, three eyewitnesses that tell the same story, you say, well, wow, that sounds like that's the guy. Now, if three eyewitnesses are telling different stories, then you would say, well, maybe that's not true. So we have, as I said, a number of these people are telling us they are eyewitnesses. Now, what's ironic is that as these guys are testifying to being eyewitnesses, they're also testifying about each other. Matthew tells us about John. Luke tells us about Matthew. Mark tells us about Matthew. You know, Luke tells us about Mark. You know, they all testify about one another. They don't testify to each other as though they are corroborating their eyewitness testimonies. They testify to each other merely to the idea that they are eyewitnesses. In a courtroom, a lawyer could not have asked questions better, because they don't ask questions that are leading questions like, well, did you see Matthew write his account? And instead, it just confirms Matthew was there. Luke was there, John was there. These are people bringing together accounts, and the accounts don't differ. That's what's incredible about them. Written very different ways, they don't differ. It's a remarkable thing that we have pretty good evidence that John's account was written much later than.
And that's one of the interesting things about the Gospel of John in particular. You mentioned that it was written later. John is not one of the synoptic Gospels. That's not one that is similar because it has so many stories that the other Gospels do not have. But yet when it circles back around, as you just mentioned, to a story that's shared between all four Gospels, John's account doesn't differ. But John's account also does something interesting in a couple of places, and I'm going to point this out. The first time it shows up is in John 19. Some people ask, well, how could the apostles record things that they weren't there to see? As Jesus' body is being prepared to be taken down off the cross. And it says in verse 34 that one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. And he who has seen has testified, and his testimony is true. And he knows that he is telling the truth so that you also may believe. So you have this statement by the author of John saying that the person that saw this happen, that he testified as having seen this, and we know his testimony is true. You have another one of those statements that comes up at the end of the Gospel of John. There's a very natural conclusion to the John's Gospel in the 20th chapter, where you have the statements in verse 30, many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. But you get into John 21, and there's this other story about the restoration of Peter, if you will. And it has this interesting statement at the end of it, where some people believe that maybe this part of the Gospel of John wasn't written by John, but it might have been written by someone else who was there with them, because of this signing statement that they make about what has been recorded. This is after Peter asked Jesus, how long will the beloved disciple live? Jesus says, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me, in verse 23. Therefore, this saying went out among the brethren that this disciple would not die. Whoever the beloved disciple is, and a lot of people say it's the Apostle John, but whoever the beloved disciple is, that the story went out among the brethren that he wasn't ever going to die. And this seems to have been written to correct that misconception. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but only, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? This is the disciple who is testifying of these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. And there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that even the world itself would not contain the books that would be written. So you have this verification of eyewitness testimony in the Gospel of John, because somebody may hold up a finger and say, hey, wait, how do you know that's true? That not only did the person writing this record, whoever it is, the apostles actually step in and say, yeah, we know his testimony is true. We were there to see it. The Bible's kind of pre-answering some of these questions and some of these objections that people might make. It sets it apart from the category that you would put legendary or mythical figures into. And let's talk a little bit about that. We could get into the resurrection evidence, but I think I want to save that for another episode. Let's talk about, is Jesus fact? Is he myth, or is he legend? What's the difference between a myth and a legend?
That's a good question. I'm actually looking for you to explain that one to me. A lot of times I would say one of those is something that is passed down orally and one is passed down written, but I actually don't think that that's accurate. So I'd like to know. I'd like to know myself.
Generally speaking, if I understand it, a legend has the capacity for having some kind of historicity to it, like Johnny Appleseed kind of thing. Like there was actually a figure, but maybe that figure was blown out of proportion. So we're going to look at Jesus in three different ways. Is he a myth, or is he a legend, or is he what the Bible says that he is? And so to do that, I want to look at some of the arguments that are made or objections that are raised. How about this, Brian, that most contemporary historians, and I think you've already addressed this to some degree, but most contemporary historians are silent when it comes to Jesus. What do we say about that?
Yeah, so that's a pretty common claim that they'll say contemporary, and they're going to put contemporary within 50 years of Jesus. So there's a couple of things to say. First of all, there really is almost no dispute that the New Testament was written within 50 years, 70 years of Jesus. You and I would say within 40 years of Jesus. We would be a little more pointing to our belief and inspiration. But the point is, even an unbelieving historian is going to acknowledge that the New Testament, that the manuscripts of the New Testament existed by the end of the 2nd century. So that there is no debate, there's no real debate that the New Testament existed. So the New Testament stands as a contemporary historian. What they're really looking for is a non-believing historian, a hostile witness, if you would. And I guess the first thing I would say is that it's actually not true that there is no contemporary historian, because Jesus or Christianity are both a reference by a number of contemporary historians. You've already mentioned Tacitus, who about 100 years after Jesus writes about Christianity and writes about his understanding of who Jesus was. We know that more closely to the time of Jesus, Pliny the Younger writes a record of interrogating Christians. It should be considered as a testimony of Jesus. I know many wouldn't say it is.
Josephus, he wrote that, if memory serves, wasn't he appealing to someone for better instruction on how to?
Yes, to Trajan. Yeah, to the Emperor
that's the letter
Trajan.
I was thinking about.
I think I might have been closer to 110 or 120, but still, it's within a lifetime. It's within, like I said, people that would have been alive potentially that either would have known Jesus's apostles or such. So you have that connection to that they're talking about these things. We also have, as I said, Josephus, who was Judeo-Roman writer. A lot of people are very skeptical of Josephus because Josephus probably indulged in the facts oftentimes. But the bigger importance is that Josephus was not a friend of Christianity, that he should be seen as a hostile witness. He was a Pharisee. He was part of these groups that had rejected Christianity. He was part of the rebellion that took place in 70 AD. So he has a direct testimony there. Now, what's interesting is he really doesn't give us much information about Jesus. He'll mention Jesus in passing, but he'll talk more about Jesus's brother James, which is a real remarkable testimony that he'll give us. And of course, his testimony there, he's been being no friend of Christianity. Neither his goal nor his desire is to talk much about it. And it's actually one of the things we have to consider is that historians in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century that are writing about world events, Christianity was not a world event in their sight. Christianity was a movement that most people found kind of deplorable. It had no real value to most people. It wasn't as though the movers and shakers of the world were Christians. And so there isn't going to be much relevant testimony in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century. If Christianity is what it claims to be, which is a religion that doesn't seek power and it doesn't seek to overthrow governments, it's not going to show up in history. And in fact, we've probably seen that throughout the last 2,000 years, that the people that are practitioners of that pure basic Christianity tend to have little or no historical record because they just aren't the kind of people that make those kind of waves.
Okay, so let's break this down. So you got Trajan, you got Pliny the Younger writing to Trajan, which again is less than 40 years after the end of the 1st century. So within, call it 50 years of the last book of the New Testament being written, right? You have Josephus recording that, you have Tacitus recording that, You also have fragments that go back to the first century, fragments that go back to the second century, almost entire books that go back to the end of the second century, beginning of the third century. And on top of that, you have a mountain of other kinds of evidence that validate the Bible, which is about Jesus. I remember up until a few years ago, there were all kinds of arguments over whether or not Pilate actually existed. And I don't think anybody denies that anymore because we've actually found coins with his inscription on them. I don't know of anyone today that's a legitimate scholar or historian that doubts that Pontius Pilate actually existed. That was something that for years, biblical skeptics would hang their hat on and say there was no Pontius Pilate. There's no record of him. Within the last 50 years, we found a mountain of evidence that supports him. Guess what the first document was to testify that he existed? Well, it's the Bible. And it adds not just to the historical accuracy of the Bible, but it's further evidence that Jesus existed. But how about this claim, Brian, and this is a common one, that the Gospels are biased, that you have people that were making money off of the Gospels. They didn't want to admit that their Messiah had failed. Are the Gospels biased? What would you say to that? I'll give you first crack at that one.
That's kind of an interesting claim because right off the top, I would say, yeah, they really are biased because the people that wrote them had invested their entire life into the life of Jesus Christ. Now, but the point is, none of them are trying to deceive us by saying, hey, I'm not writing this. They are very clear. John says, hey, I wrote this book so that you'll believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. That these men are telling us what it is that they want us to walk away understanding. They're not trying to be unbiased. They're trying to get us to believe what they're believing. But the point is, there's no historian that writes that way, that writes without a bias, without an interest. And if somebody tells you they do, then you probably can't trust their testimony. If a historian tells you they're biased right off the top, then you know where they're coming from. Even today, I like a history written by somebody who really found somebody really interesting. It's like watching the news. If a news service came out and said, yeah, we have a bias, it's towards this candidate, or a news service says we have no bias, but they clearly have a bias, which one do you feel like is more honest with you? And you're going to say, well, the one that tells me I have a bias, that's going to be it. So I don't have a problem saying that the Gospels are biased, but at the same time, they're also written by people that are prepared to die as a testimony to the veracity of the things that they're saying.
Okay. And there you go. I think this is the most foolish of claims. In fact, it's almost laughably foolish when you think about it. Everybody writes with a bias, but the fact that there is a belief that they start with does not mean that the evidence is forged. In fact, the biggest testimony to me that these men are being authentic and true is the fact that they were not keeping a movement together that kept them wealthy or in power. Go read 2 Corinthians and look at what Paul suffered for the cause of Christ. In fact, he calls them momentary light afflictions in chapter 4, working for him an exceedingly eternal weight of glory. The idea that these men suffered, that they lost their fortunes, that they gave up their lives, they weren't gaining anything by this. The greatest indication of bias was the fact that they wouldn't recant their testimony, that their bias is that they legitimately believe that these things are true. They're not reporters. They're not just recording facts. They are recording what they saw because they want to share it with the world. And that's a totally different level of authenticity. Move on to the idea of miracles being impossible. I find this one kind of funny because we're dealing in the realm of God here. The miracles really shouldn't present an issue at all. I mean, if you believe that God exists, if you don't believe that God exists, then they can't be used to confirm or deny either way, I would think, because you've got to start out by proving that God doesn't exist to say that the miracles prove that Jesus didn't exist. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Of course, there is a circular reasoning to say, I can't believe in miracles, therefore I can't believe in Jesus, because you're saying that that I'm choosing not to believe something, therefore it's logically deduced that I don't believe it. It's a logical fallacy. But here's what's interesting about these ideas. The miracles Jesus performs, of course, are very low key. One of the things the New Testament testifies to is Jesus tells about every time he does a miracle, don't tell anybody about this. Keep this quiet. It is interesting that seems to be the case. Now, just as an aside, there are miracles that happen outside of the life of Christ that are testified to in history. And that's actually a very interesting conversation just in part.
Yes.
So in the Old Testament, recorded in the book of 2 Kings, Isaiah, Chronicles, the story of how the city of Jerusalem was surrounded by the Assyrian army, and the angel of the Lord goes out and kills 200,000 men, approximately, of the Assyrian army. That actually is testified to in ancient history. The Greeks wrote about that 200,000 of the men were killed, and the Greeks say by the gods. Now, not God, but they just say it was a divine God that goes. So you actually have a miraculous event that's testified to in history. You can point to things like Belshazzar's feast night and him dying that night. Well, that actually, like I said, the Babylonian Chronicle tells us, actually, maybe not the Babylonian Chronicle, it might have been the Greek story of the Babylonians testifies to his demise. There's lots of events that happened in ancient history that were miraculous or supernatural that there are records of. And what do we do with those? We just kind of water them down and come up with a way that they weren't supernatural. So the point is, if every Roman writer in the first century said, wow, we saw this guy die and he came back to life, we wouldn't believe it. We'd say, yeah, but because it's impossible, it can't be historically relevant. Well,
Right.
at that point, what you're acknowledging is no matter how much evidence is put before you, you refuse to believe something. And by the way, the Bible
Yeah.
talks a lot about that kind of attitude, where Jesus says many times, I could do all the miracles in the world, you're not going to believe. Jesus would talk about the idea of the wicked generation that wants a sign.
And isn't it interesting? And John mentions that at the end of that gospel, that if we recorded all the signs that Jesus did or all the works that he did, it's doubtful that the world could contain the scroll. But think about that for a second, that again, pointing to things that we once said there was no evidence of, that there is. Nobody's going to deny that the Babylonian Empire came to an end. Nobody's going to deny that the Assyrian army was wiped out in the siege of Jerusalem. That was far too big of an army to have ever been wiped out that way. So again, that kind of takes us back to this point that you have a group of people that are following Jesus based on eyewitness testimony. These eyewitnesses are willing to sacrifice their lives for this testimony, and their testimony is that he did these miracles. Now, what makes the Bible kind of unique, and I think this is where it departs from myth and legend, Jesus' miracles seem kind of small when you look at them. I mean, not that they're insignificant, but they're not done on a grandiose scale. It's raising one person's dead son, or it's curing this illness, or it's feeding 5,000 people at one time. In fact, the greatest miracle that you see Jesus perform during his life is probably the feeding of the 5,000. When you think about other works of antiquity, not historical works, but other works of antiquity, when they talk about the miracles of the gods, they're earth-shattering miracles, right? That there's phoenixes burning in the sun, and there's all kinds of just over-the-top, grandiose miracles, and they always tell you the significance of that miracle. The significance of Jesus' miracle was always the lesson that he was teaching right then. It was not some grand earth-shattering thing. That Jesus didn't come to do miracles. He came to testify about the kingdom of God. The miracles were just proof that he was, in fact, a messenger from God, and that if you accepted his message, you would learn that he was the Son of God. You would learn he come to sacrifice himself for our sins. But the miracles were just kind of evidence of the message and not the other way around, which is really different from how we look at mythical figures. And that kind of brings us to our last question, Brian. And this is the one that has really taken on a life of its own recently, I'd say within the last 20 years. Maybe Jesus was a living historical figure, but he is largely copied from pagan myths like Mithras and Horus and other ancient quote unquote gods, particularly Egyptian gods. What do you have to say to that?
Yeah, the first time I heard this idea was when a popular film came out in the early 2000s called Zeitgeist. It was a conspiracy theory movie that they were trying to make, gained some traction. All the other stuff in the movie, the conspiracies that the government orchestrated 9/11 or things, but the one that somehow caught traction was that they said there's so many parallels between the stories of Jesus and the stories of, say, ancient Egyptian gods or other gods, that clearly Christianity just took these other stories from these other religions and attached them and created the myth of Jesus, and that it comes from Horus and it comes from, I remember after that movie came out, I couldn't believe how many people I would meet and they would say, oh yeah, that's true. That, they'd start throwing these facts around. And so that was an idea that caught traction in the early 2000s. There's always been a note that people have said, it's kind of interesting, Joseph Campbell and his writings about the hero saga kind of points out, that Jesus is kind of a hero saga kind of story, but he's just making a point to say that these are stories that grip us and there are certain reasons why. But when this one came out, There were people
Hmm.
that I thought dismissed the rest of these movies as nonsense, but then grabbed this one idea, the Jesus myth theory is what it's called. If you want to look that up, that it was just absurd, but people believed it.
Most of it, if you've read the Gilgamesh myth,
Yeah.
then you know that it's nothing like what you find in the Bible. That there's the claim that Horus was born of a virgin. That was not true. He was supposed to be the son of Isis and Osiris, and that he had 12 disciples. There's nothing in history that indicated that there's any Horus myth dating back to ancient Egypt of him having 12 disciples, or that there was a crucifixion of Horus. Crucifixion didn't even start until much closer to the time of Jesus, about the 6th century BC, is about when the Romans started crucifying people, and they invented that, incidentally. There's all these similarities that they claim are similarities that are not based in any kind of fact. And whether you're looking at the Gilgamesh myth or Mithras or Horus or any of these mythical figures, none of them have any similarities to Jesus that I've ever seen that could stand even the most basic scrutiny. There's just nothing there. It's a spurious claim. It's almost laughably, because it's so easy to disprove, and just go read those myths. I mean, go pick up a volume from your library on the Egyptian mythology or Greek mythology or something like that, and you'll see that those claims just are not accurate. And again, you have to come back to eyewitness testimony. That's one of the reasons why even the birth of Jesus is recorded with eyewitness testimony, that shepherds came and saw that. You don't have that with the Greek mythology or the Egyptian mythology or any of the other mythology. What do you got to say to that, Brian?
Yeah, what they're relying on is ignorance of ancient mythology. When what I there's just no good word to it. It's because flake was the word that came to my mind. The idea is what they're trying to do, what they're trying to create is they're relying on you not double checking them. For example,
Right.
one of the ones they claim a lot is there's a Egyptian god named Horus. And
Hmm.
there's an account, they'll say there's an account that he was put to death and he rose on the third day. That's not true. What is true is that there are about 30 different accounts of the life of Horus. One of them was he got stuck on a tree. One of them was he died. One of them was he was dead for 3 days before they buried him. If you cut each of those stories up and pull a part of it, you might be able to pull a story that sounds a little bit like Jesus, ignoring the fact that he also had a big falcon head.
Why would you ever want to ignore a falcon head?
That'd be awesome, right?
If I could
No,
have a
the
falcon
truth,
head,
I would, yeah. No, the truth of the matter is they're relying on what they're hoping, what they're assuming is you're not going to actually double check this. And that's actually why it's popular, because it's people that say, hey, I never really wanted to believe Jesus. So, haha. I was at a bookstore once. I'll tell you this story, Jared. And there was somebody looking at Richard Dawkins' book, one of his books. And this guy
you were in the
says,
fiction section.
well, this man and woman were in front of me and I was overhearing them talk about it. He says, oh, look, Richard Dawkins, and if something, well, you're not a Christian. You would like this. She says, oh, yeah, I'd read it, but I'd agree with it completely. So I don't need to read it. Well, that's what they're trusting, is that you're not actually going to double check anything they say, that you want them to be right so much that if they say, you're just going to, oh, it's true, I'm going to go with it. I don't even need to read it to know it's true. That's the kind
Sounds
of
a little
thing
bit
they're
like bias
relying
to
on.
me.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah,
saying,
it's more than bias. Yeah.
sounds a little bit like confirmation bias to me.
Yeah,
Well,
really
I
is
think we
extraordinary.
probably, I hope it answered the question that our users have had. There's enough evidence here for the work that Jesus did to say he goes beyond legend, that the eyewitness testimony is either factual or not. So he either exists or he doesn't. His story has been consistent since the 1st century all the way to today. Mythological figures, they just don't add up, that their stories are too convoluted. And look, we got a lot more episodes that we want to do. A lot of asked questions about Mormonism because it's on the rise lately. I think Brian and I are going to do an episode on that maybe next. I'm not sure. But we have some episodes in the pipeline about whether that is another testimony of Jesus or not. And I hope that you'll show up for that. But I'd like to see you in the comments. He's a historical figure. Until we see you next time, from all of us here at Biblically Speaking to all of you out there, have a good day and God bless.